Hey friends, your pal Mike Shea from Sly Flourish. Today, we're going to take a look at running Chapter 1 from the Kobold Press adventure Empire of the Ghouls. This show, like all of the work of Sly Flourish, is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. If you want to get access to exclusive adventures, exclusive city source books, access to a dedicated Discord channel, and access to the monthly Patreon Q&A, you can do so by becoming a patron of Sly Flourish. And you can find a link to that in the show notes below. And to the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your support. I want to share my experiences running Empire of the Ghouls, in particular, what it was like to get started running this campaign, and talk about running Chapter 1. I'm not even yet fully through Chapter 1 yet, but I wanted to do a video to talk about my experiences, and I will hopefully do a video for each of the chapters of Empire of the Ghouls as we go. It has been very interesting. One of the things I was very excited about with this campaign was breaking away from all first-party adventures, all adventures written by Wizards of the Coast, which I've run many. I've run like 16 different adventures from Wizards of the Coast. And I wanted to run a few big campaigns from third-party publishers. Kobold Press is one of my favorite publishers, and Empire of the Ghouls looked like a really cool one. It was a really good opportunity to do a few things. One, run a campaign in a completely different setting. And two, to use a lot of third-party material for character options and DM options as well. So one of the things I wanted to do was, instead of using Tasha's and Xanathar's, which is pretty typical, you use a player's handbook plus Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Instead, Tasha's and Xanathar's are out, and the Midgard Heroes Handbook is in, and the Tome of Heroes is in. Now, we're still using a couple of little features from Tasha's, like the flexible attribute shifts, or you can move your attributes to whatever, or you can move your ability bonuses to whatever ability score you want, and a few of the other quality of life changes that exist in Tasha's. But the subclasses we're not including. The subclasses and the spells from either Tasha's or Xanathar's Guide we are not including. And instead, we are including the spells and features that exist in Tome of Heroes and Midgard Heroes, which has been particularly interesting. So I'm going to talk about all of that. I'm going to talk about what it was like to do with Session 0. I'm going to talk about what it was like using these other character options, all that kind of stuff. So we'll start by taking a look at my one-page campaign summary for Empire of the Ghouls. You can find a link to this one-page summary in the show notes below. If you happen to like the template for this, patrons of Sly Flourish have access to a Word version of the template so they can make their own one-page guideline. Because really, every one-page campaign guideline should be customized around the group that you're running. It doesn't really work that you just grab this whole cloth and run it right for your group. You're probably going to want to customize it. So what I always try to do with a one-page guide is sort of get the players to understand the kind of world that they're going to be in, to understand what kind of campaign they're going to be in, and to give their characters the motivation to head off in a certain direction. So what I typically do is ask players for a Session 0 to not show up with a character yet. They can have some character concepts in mind, but I don't want them too wired around a character before they've had a chance to hear what the other players are thinking. And that way, during a Session 0, we can kind of go back and forth. They can riff off one another. They can come up with backgrounds. And the groups are generally tighter. It's always a little convoluted. Like, everybody's sort of like, well, who goes first? And how do we want to do this? And am I going to take the rogue? Or are you going to take the rogue? There's a little bit of that, but it seems to me that works better than having 6 independently created characters suddenly show up in one game. So I usually ask that they either come with no characters or 2 characters. And why I ask why they have 2 is that way, and I say don't fall in love with either of them. Bring 2 different ones, and you get to kind of pick like which one you want to do. So if you're really like eager to make a character and you just can't help yourself, that's fine, but make a second one too. Then about 2 days before we're going to get together, I send this guide out. So they have at least something that they've read ahead of time, so they have a little bit of an idea what they're doing. But I don't send it out too early because I don't want them to think about it too long. I only want to give them like a day or two, and most of the time they don't have time to build a whole character between the time that they get this and the time that they go. The one-page guide here talks about the main theme, that darkness is growing beneath the crossroads of Midgard to the north of vampire overlords, rule of the Blood Kingdom. They're sending the nobility of former Empire of Cracovia into exile. This is all part of the theme. By the way, this is full of spoilers for Empire of the Ghouls, so be aware I'm going to be spoiling this adventure pretty thoroughly. If you plan on running an Empire of the Ghouls, you probably want to avoid this video. But all of the stuff that you're seeing on this sheet is stuff that I expect the players and the characters to know, that this is common knowledge. These are not secrets. These are not things I'm holding back to expose during the game. These are things that the characters know. They know that there's this war that's taken place to the north. They know the vampires have taken over. They know that the Empire of Cracovia has gone into exile. They know that the dwarves have become more insular, and that political strife and societal violence is beginning to grow and boiling up in the city of Zobek. And the starting location for this campaign is the free city of Zobek, set right dead center in the middle of Midgard. So I then have like the truths of Midgard. These are the things that I want the players to know, the things that I want the characters to know. That Zobek is the city at the heart of the world. It's a freestanding city. I have a little bit longer descriptions in here than I typically do because we're in a whole new world. So I want to kind of reveal more about Midgard, this world that Kobold Press kind of operates in. I want to reveal more of that to the players because it's an unknown world. It's not like it's just another region of the Forgotten Realms. It's a whole different place. But that said, we still do that spiral development where you're focused around the city of Zobek, what's going around Zobek and the problems that are going on there. And we don't need to expand super wide into all kinds of different areas. That said, a lot of the players they spent some time reading about the different races and classes that they were picking and the different backgrounds that they were picking and how that fit into Midgard. And so they had a lot of Midgard lore wired into their characters already. And I'll talk more about like the products that really helped with that. We start off in the free city of Zobek. It talks about where it exists, that the Blood Kingdom is to the north, east of the Dwarvish cantons, the Magdar Kingdom, the Margrave Forest is nearby, to the Southlands are to the south. So it's really right in the dead center. And all of those places are going to come into play. And one of the things about Empire of the Ghouls that didn't really surprise me, but it's something that I definitely raised an eyebrow and said, I'm going to have to make sure that pay attention to this, is it is huge in scope and scale. You travel like 3,000 miles in this game. You're all over the place. So for an adventure that really exposes all of the major areas of Midgard, a real travel log of Midgard, this is a great adventure for that. If you were looking for a clear, focused adventure that focused on one major location and kind of the adventures going on in that location, this is not the adventure to you. But if you want one where there's a lot of travel to the north, a lot of travel to the south, and it gives a lot of opportunity to use a lot of different products that Kobold Press has put out that reveal these places, this is definitely for that. But it's definitely worth considering early how you're going to handle that travel, what you're going to do for that, how you're going to make sure that stays fun. Because if a lot of long distance travel is not for you, this might not be a great campaign. Then we talked about like what's going on in Zobek itself, that within the last century, the citizens of Zobek overthrew House Strauss, a terrible leader who ruled over the city for 600 years. They ruled with an iron fist. They were really terrible people. And at that point, the city of Zobek became a free setter city governed by the mayor and 11 consuls. So they have an elected political arm when they didn't before. I talk about the ley lines and shadow roads, that there are these magical ley lines that the elves have put into place many centuries ago, but now they have sort of fallen into disarray, and now there's these shadow roads. That's getting into the options for travel that I plan on bringing in here. And one of the products that I plan on tapping into a lot for this part of it is Ebon Tides. Ebon Tides is a new book Kobold Press just put out that talks all about the ley lines and the shadow roads and the realm of shadow and the things that are going on there. The rise of the Blood Kingdom, the fact that you have these vampires. And I didn't really tie the ghouls into this too much because I didn't want to play my hand about the ghoul Imperium too early. So I kind of pulled that part out, even though it is getting kind of common knowledge. But the idea is like, hey, there's a big vampire war that happened to the north, and that they overthrew the people of the Empire of Cracovia, and that there's rising tension in Zobek, that the external dangers are getting to be, they're sort of growing, and the city of Zobek is becoming more of a hotbed. So that's definitely a big part of Chapter 1. And I guess it's going to lead more into Chapter 1, and that will kind of get solved as Chapter 1. Chapter 1's almost its own like mini campaign. Like I'm handling like a mini campaign. So they talked about who the characters are in Midgard. They're native to Zobek or travelers from Medicinal Land, but they're starting off in Zobek. They're working together. The players that brought their characters in really integrated well. They had lots of backgrounds, but in many cases, like, oh yeah, he and I were both traveling companions together, or he hired, this guy thinks he's my lawyer. Very funny stuff. I mentioned that the campaign features a lot of overland travel over many regions. I want the players to know there's going to be a lot of travel, that, they're going to head far to the north, they're going to head far to the south, they're going to head down into Dungeons Deep. So I want them to know that there's going to be a fair bit of, they're not just going to be sitting in the city of Zobek the whole time. And then I talk about character creation. So what I decided to do for character creation, because I really wanted to experiment more with third-party material, I wanted to bring in these other books. I wanted to make my own D&D, the D&D that I run at my table, stronger by bringing in lots of sources from lots of different places instead of just focusing on things that Wizards of the Coast provides. So I said we're going to use the Player's Handbook, Midgard Heroes Handbook, and Tome of Heroes. I'll get into why I included both the Midgard Heroes Handbook and Tome of Heroes, which both seem like they're very similar books, but there's actually a good reason to include both. Then I said that, you can use the class options and attribute allocations from Tasha's, but not subclasses or spells. Should any ability, and that's actually not true because there are some Tasha spells that I will include, like the conjure animal ones are way better than the summon. So there's a couple spells that I would replace for Tasha's, and we kind of handle that one-on-one. One thing that I'm kind of adding, and as I bring in any new third-party material, I'm probably going to have this conversation with the players up front, that every so often we'll run into stuff from any source material, whether it's Wizards of the Coast or whether it's from a third-party publisher, that if there's a weird ability or combination of sources that ends up being disruptive to the game, I'm going to work with the player to try to figure out a better option. This is my, hey, I know you love Twilight Sanctuary a lot, but it's really making it harder for me to run the game. Can we come up with an alternative? This isn't just plain nerfs, like, oh, that's overpowered. It's really when it becomes harder for me to run the game or more difficult for the players to really enjoy the game. If there's anything where it's being what I consider something to be externally disruptive to the game, that's something I want to come up with. And that's because I have not read everything that's in Tome of Heroes or Midgard Heroes. And I don't know that there's stuff in there, weird combinations of stuff are going to end up breaking the game. I just don't know. So anytime I'm bringing any new material, I'm probably going to have this in my one-page guide to say, there may be times where we run into weird combinations of skills, abilities, and whatever, spells that are disruptive to the game. And I will work with the player who has the character that has these to try to come up with an alternative. Hey, we're going to work together to try to nerf. I'm not going to just nerf stuff so repetitiously. I'm going to talk to the player about it. And I've done that in the past. I did have a player who brought in a Twilight Cleric as a subclass, and I explained my issue with Twilight Sanctuary, and we came up with an alternative, and he was like, the alternative is fine, and it was less disruptive to the game. So the characters beginning at first level. We calculated ability scores using either standard or point buy. I have this new one of like, instead of worrying about your ability bonuses and where you put them and how you use point buy, that instead we have a standard array of 16, 14, 14, 12, 12, 8. I made that right after I made this guide and was working with players. I was like, it's so much easier if you just say your ability scores are 16, 14, 14, 12, 12, 8. You decide where they go. If you don't want to do a point buy, you can do a point buy if you really want to manipulate things. But if you don't want to do a point buy, it's much easier to just do this. And I said, because we're using material not in D&D Beyond, that I recommended using a paper-based character sheet like it's 1978. The optional feat and multi-class rules are allowed for this campaign. So you do get to use feats. You can do multi-class. I'm not really sure if I should include multi-class because we already have this weird combination of abilities. But my point was like, this might be harder than what you can just throw into D&D Beyond. And I'm going to talk about that. But there was a little bit of a struggle for the players to move to paper-based character sheets. But this is an in-person game. I think even if it was online, that would still not be a terrible way to go. But I know online, I might have been more willing to use like Roll20 to do character creation online because Roll20 does include these third-party sources. Because we're already playing in person, I thought it'd be kind of fun to just use regular old paper character sheets. But I do know that players, a few players, a handful of players, still generated a character in D&D Beyond, even though they just substituted other options just to make sure their math was right. So they used it for things like calculating skills, for making sure their hit points were correct, for a lot of the other math that they would be doing that, they would be doing by hand. They just kind of pushed that stuff into D&D Beyond, saw what it is, and then they wrote it down on their physical character sheet. So then I have my 2 sets of safety tools that I included in here. I include this again. These are all included in just about every game I run. I talked about pause for a minute, this idea that at any time, anybody in the campaign can say, let's pause for a minute. We break out of character. We listen to what the person has to say, and we discuss what that means. And it can be anything from an actual safety issue. Hey, I'm really not comfortable with the area that we're going into this, or pause for a minute. If you could be a little less descriptive of the crazy gore. It could also be for, I don't really understand where we're headed with this. In this conversation, what is our goal? Or, I'm sorry, I'm lost. Where are we now? Physically, where are we right now? So you can use it for a lot of different things. So I talk about that. The other one are lines and veil. Lines are things so I describe what the campaign might have, which also includes my own lines and veils. But then we also discuss it with the players on any other additional lines or veils that they might have. We can always add them to the list. And so this one actually, King Empire of the Ghouls has a lot of different content that I think is worth pointing out to make sure players are comfortable with it. There's a lot of areas that it gets into that I think I would consider to be sensitive areas. And I wanted to make sure that, some of those sensitive areas I'm not comfortable with. So I'm just going to remove them, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the sensitive areas are like, okay, I just want to be careful with this. So the examples are that, hey, here's the things that it does have. It does have undead eating folk, unholy rituals, sacrifice entire societies of terrible people, kidnapping, ghouls, gore, murder, blood, more ghouls, physical restraint, rats, insects, and even more ghouls. Those are things that are in it and could be overt. Then there are things that I consider to be veiled and off-screen, and that includes torture, slavery, racism, bondage, discipline, and consensual sadomasochism and drug use. The consensual sadomasochism is a weird one. I'll get into it. Chapter 1 in particular has a lot of what I would refer to, and I know I might be prudish, as weird sex stuff. And it's not that I'm against weird sex stuff. And it's all consensual in the book. I think it's mostly consensual. I think there's times where people are like under influences of drugs and things like that. And that could be a little creepy. There was enough stuff that I was like, I'm gonna put that. I'm gonna either veil that heavily, or I'm just gonna change it, because it's not even a matter of like, are we uncomfortable with it, or is it putting somebody in an uncomfortable situation? Sometimes it's like you put this stuff on the table, and as a I don't know exactly a defense mechanism, but a way to handle this kind of weird, uncomfortable situation is to sort of joke about it, and then the jokes compound, and next thing you know, it heads off in areas that you really didn't want to go. And it's not like everybody there's like, oh, this is horrible, I can't hear this stuff. It's just like, is that really the direction you wanted the game to go? Is that the idea of the story that you wanted to go? And I'm thinking, no, that's not really what I want to do. So a lot of the weird sort of BDSM, I'm actually not including that. I'm focusing more on drug use and less away from the BDSM, just because I don't want to like, put dry kindling out there for the fire. Oh, hey, my mom is here. Hi, Mom. And then I have there things that are lined, things that we are not going to have. Any sort of non-consensual sexual contact or harassment, player-initiated torture, player-initiated racism, which is definitely an important one for this campaign, and I'll get into why. Violence towards animal, violence towards children, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia. None of that is going to be in the game. And those are hard lines that I'm bringing into the game. Now, any players that had any other hard lines, and I think when I talked about it with the players, nobody had anything else that they added to this list. I'll talk a little bit about the characters that we hit in there. They're referred to as the people who care, but then they're like, well, are we all people? Because boy, there's a lot of different people. So Bruno, who's played by my wife, is a bearfolk barbarian. I refer to barbarian occultist. And what's really neat is, so she's a barbarian bearfolk, but she has this, like, she's the one that's kind of like sort of interested, she doesn't want to be part of a cult, but she likes kind of investigating cults and knowing what's going on with cults, which is great because there's a product by Kobold Press called Demon Cults and Secret Societies. And I can basically say, like, this book that I'm holding, your character has a copy of this. She's able to go through and be like, oh yeah, this is about those the bat cultists. So she's able to kind of dig into that. So that's really fun. We have Durham, played by Brian, who is a dwarf wizard, a guild artisan, and gunsmith. His wizard type is the gunslinger wizard type, which is one of the subclass types that exists in Kobold Press in either Midgard Heroes or Tome of Heroes. HB, played by Jerry, is an arena, which are like hedgehog folk. First, it's very interesting. Jerry always seems to play the anthropomorphic animal. So he is now a hedgehog. He is a hedgehog rogue, and he thinks he's a lawyer. So he refers to himself continually as Rohalland's attorney. And, which is just great fun. And he picked up, when they fought bat cultists in one of the places, he got a hold of a sacrificial sickle, a sickle that they used. And the sickle is tied to the bat folk and lets him once per day sprout bat wings and fly. And so every so often he'll say like some sarcastic statement to like an official and then sprout the wings and fly. And they're like, did that hedgehog person just sprout bat wings and fly? So we have Rohalland, who is a human druid, is an innkeeper. In the story, he is actually the owner of the inn that plays prominently in chapter 1 of Empire of the Ghouls. I'll talk about that. Ved Pinion, played by my friend Paul, is a gearforged ranger. He's a kobold gearforged. So he's actually very old. I think it's a he. Is very old. But it was a kobold that was put into Gearforge form, which is really kind of interesting. So he has a longer connection to the history of the kobolds in Zobek, and in fact remembers the time when the kobolds were all sort of enslaved by the families, the Strauss family who ruled over the town. Versi is played by my friend George. He is a ranger sentry, and he is a bouncer of the inn, of the tavern that plays, which is known as the Southern Mirage. It was originally known as like the Rampant Roach, and they changed the name to the Southern Mirage. And we have Winasia, played by my friend Mike, who is a Minotaur Paladin Amazon. She is from the eastern tribes of the Minotaurs that trained heavily in archery, but she herself is not an archer. So those are the characters that we had. Again, they were all kind of built together during that session 0. Worked really well. You can see we have Bearfolk, we have Arena, we have Gearforged, we have a Frostfell Elf, and we have Minotaur. So they definitely picked of the races that are more prominent with Kobold Press stuff. I think Rohalland James played a human, and that's because James, when he generates his character, randomly rolls to see what kind of character he's going to work with. He doesn't pick. He likes to randomly roll and see what comes up and then pick from that, which I have a lot of respect for. It means he's a human in a environment where pretty much everybody else, I guess Durham, Brian did play a dwarf, and a dwarf is a pretty standard race here. So not only did I see running Empire of the Ghouls as an opportunity to run this particular campaign, but also an opportunity to dive into the world of Midgard. The Midgard Worldbook, for example, is this huge world that goes on. It's really, really cool. Very rich book. I really, really like it. And this is an opportunity to run a whole campaign and for people to explore it. And Empire of the Ghouls is a really good campaign to do it. In a very similar way that if you wanted to dive deep into the Sword Coast of Forgotten Realms, if you really wanted to have an adventure that showed off most of the Sword Coast, an adventure like Horde of the Dragon Queen, which is also written by Kobold Press, by the way, or Storm King's Thunder, really can have characters travel all over. Empire of the Ghouls is sort of Horde of the Dragon Queen or Storm King's Thunder kind of adventure for Midgard. You travel everywhere. So it means not only do you get to use the material that's in Empire of the Ghouls, but I also get to use all these other books that I've got. And I have a whole bunch of other books that I really wanted to dive into. This was really my big opportunity to use all of these other Kobold Press products. So that includes the Midgard Heroes Handbook, Tome of Heroes. Tome of Heroes is brand new. This is a great big book of new character options. Huge book, bigger than Xanathar's and Tasha's. Tons and tons of new character options. The original Book of Lairs, this is the one that came out with the Tome of Beasts. The original Tome of Beasts had a book called the Book of Lairs. I actually wrote one of the adventures in it called Den of the Rotten Kings, and that was an adventure that I ran. I think it's the first time I've ran my own adventure. I ran Den of Rotten Kings as part of Chapter 1 of Empire of the Ghouls. So you get to use stuff like that. There's of course, all of the Tomes of Beasts and creature codices, all of the books that Kobold Press is putting out that include all of these new monsters. Many of those monsters. This is a great opportunity to use Kobold Press monsters. My players regularly said, like, why does Mike hate us so much? And oh my God, he's using another Kobold Press monster again. Because they definitely hit harder and are more dangerous than what you might expect from the vanilla 5e monsters that are out there. They definitely hit hard at all levels. So I like that. I'm able to tune it pretty carefully. But like, they ran a game this past Wednesday and they almost wiped out fighting a bunch of rat folk because a couple of the rat folk rogues are really pretty dangerous. So I really dug that. The Vault of Magic, of course, big book full of magic items. You can use that in any 5e game, but because I'm kind of focusing a lot on Kobold Press material, I wanted to use the Vault of Magic, and I did. I mentioned Demon Cults and Secret Societies, which is a really fun book that covers all these different cults, and because they're traveling around so much, there's many different groups that we can operate there. So Demon Cults and Secret Societies is a book that I think it was a Kickstarter from a while back. I can't remember if it was a Kickstarter or whether you can just buy it. But it gave me an opportunity because there's a lot of different cults that are in here. So the Red Sisters play a big part in Chapter 1 of the game, Chapter 1 of Empire of the Ghouls. And I also wanted to bring in the Emerald Order. The Emerald Order is this they're sort of a heavy arcane focused guild from the south. But I wanted to use the Emerald Order and actually a particular member of the Emerald Order as sort of a driver to kind of push the characters in a particular direction, to say like, hey, these things that you're doing here in Midgard, what you're doing here, it actually has a bigger effect. There is a major plot that's going on right now, and I'm only just beginning to see the edges of it, but it's here and it's involved. And because one of the characters is an occultist, this member of the Emerald Order was able to directly talk to her and say, like, you should go to this place at this time because something is going to happen that's going to put you on a path to something even greater. And my thought is like the Emerald Order is trying to manipulate the situation that's going on with the ghouls to try to get an advantage themselves. And I think the characters are going to have the opportunity to travel to the south because in Empire of the Ghouls, you go to the south. And I don't know if you go to Nuria Natal, which is like the city there, the Emerald Order goes, but I will probably bring it there. This is another opportunity to bring in a lot of different groups, a lot of different factions into this very widespread campaign. One of the fun bits is they were going to go find out secret information from a corrupt council member. And to do so, they were going through the Undercity, which is like the underground grotto underneath Zobek. And they felt like a dark presence, and they heard some things. They fought some weird bats, and they went in and they fought a priestess of the Night Cauldron of Chernobog, this other cult, this bat cult, and they fought and killed a bat cult, and they were looking around and they're like, we think this altar, like the altar was really old and it wasn't just focused, and they're like, is this sort of like a community altar? Like other cultists can come here and conduct their rituals, and like Thursdays is Cauldron of the Chernobog Day, and the Sanguine Path comes here on Fridays, and Selkex Sting their Saturday afternoons. So it's like the YMCA for evil cults. But that was really, they had a good time, and that was a fun way to introduce this whole other group. And again, not tied into the major plot line, but just something they do. And they got a cool magic item. They had a nice fun battle. I got to use a cool Dwarven Forge setup and a cool magic weapon from it. So this is really, I'm enjoying the ability to kind of tap into all of this lore, all of this stuff that's coming in from all of these other sources that I can kind of draw in and use. And it reminds me very much of my Numenera game. I've been doing very much the same thing with the Numenera game, where I'm trying to use like as much Numenera material as I can, because, it's like my one big opportunity to run a nice big campaign in this area. I don't know how many of these I'm going to get, so I want to just draw in as much material as I can. I'm doing the same thing with this and all of these other Kobold Press books that have come out, both for myself and the players, by offering up the Midgard Heroes and Tome of Heroes. Why did I use both Midgard Heroes Handbook and Tome of Heroes? And the reason why is that the Midgard Heroes Handbook is actually more tied to Midgard, where Tome of Heroes was really designed to be a general guide of classes, races, backgrounds, and subclasses for any RPG. But in many cases, Tome of Heroes includes material or updated material that the Midgard Heroes Handbook had. So I ended up including both. This was based on Richard Green's recommendation. I asked him, like, hey, should I use Tome of Heroes as the main source book? Because it would make sense. It's a great big book full of character options. He's like, well, there's a lot of really good backgrounds in the Midgard Heroes Handbook. And it ended up that my players used a good mix of both. I think many of them ended up using the Midgard Heroes Handbook. Depending on what you're running, you don't want to get confused. There is both a Midgard Heroes Handbook for 5th edition and a Midgard Heroes book for 5th edition. And they are not the same book. Midgard Heroes is a smaller book. It came out earlier. That one came back out back in 2015. The Midgard Heroes Handbook, I think, includes a lot of the material in the original Midgard Heroes book. But the Midgard Heroes book was really a conversion of 3.5 and Pathfinder material to 5e, where the Midgard Heroes Handbook had sort of more development done on it. So you definitely want to pick up the Midgard Heroes Handbook, not Midgard Heroes book. I got that confused with one of my players. It's like, oh, I bought it and he bought the wrong one. I was very sad. One of the tricky bits about running a campaign where you're going to offer up these different class options is that D&D Beyond makes it so easy to share this material, because if you're using the material that's in D&D, using D&D Beyond makes it so easy. But in particular, if I buy a product from D&D Beyond, I can share that with all of my players and they can just use it. But if we're playing, in my game, we're playing at the table. And I wanted people to have options of these books, but telling them like, hey, go buy the Midgard Heroes Handbook for $25 in PDF. And then also buy the Tome of Heroes for another $30. That's $55 just in PDFs. That's more than the price of a single hardcover book for just the 2 PDFs. So what I ended up doing is I went and bought an extra copy of the PDFs, which then at the table we can kind of share on different tablets and things like that. And so I have copies of physical books, and then I have my own copies of the digital books, and then I have an extra copy, and then a couple of the players pick them up too. So we have enough to kind of cover everybody, but there's a bit of like, it's kind of a high price if you want to say like, oh, we want to include this material, but you have to go buy these other 2 books and everybody has to buy them, or you have to share them at the table. The problem is, because it's so much new material, that sharing at the table isn't really that practical because there's a lot of material to read. So that ended up being a problem. I think a better solution to this is to buy it on Roll20. If your players have Roll20 accounts, if they're willing to even log in Roll20, you can actually buy both of these products on Roll20, and you can share them through the Compendium on Roll20, even if you're not using Roll20 for anything else, even if you're not running the game in Roll20 or building characters in Roll20 or anything like that. Now, maybe your players say, sure, I want to go ahead and use Roll20. I want to use the character builder in Roll20 with these options so I can build my characters there. That's certainly fine. But even if they want to do it in paper, even if they want to do it by hand, the ability to buy one copy of the book on Roll20 and then share it with your players out on Roll20 is really advantageous. And that's something that there isn't really a good way to do it otherwise, other than saying like, hey, you want to use these books, you have to buy both. So what I've generally done is said like, hey, we're going to, I will buy a copy. I have both a digital and a physical copy. I'll buy an extra digital copy and we'll share that around. And sometimes when they find the material that they want, they can copy and paste the material that they want into their character sheet or into a text file. So they have the stuff for their character. Like if they pick a subclass, they could just like, print out those copies. I think we did this. We print out the copies of that subclass option, which then they can take and slide into their player's handbook or something like that. So that can work. But sharing, it's one of these things where like learning how to play again after using D&D Beyond for a few years is really challenging. And I talk about the importance of us like not relying on D&D Beyond for our overall joy of D&D, that if we want this hobby to remain strong for us individually, we need to remember that D&D Beyond is basically a license, and it's a license that can go away, and they can kind of decide what they want to do with it. They can decide who they let in, who they don't allow in. So it's super, super convenient. And boy, I can tell you, my players love D&D Beyond. I think every player in all my groups really like D&D Beyond. Some of them definitely recognize the danger that it poses. And I have a couple that are like, no, we're going to just stick to paper character sheets. And you can do it. It's really not that hard to do paper character sheets. But boy, it's so convenient. But that convenience comes at a cost. And that cost is that it limits the amount of material you can use and everything like that. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So the other material that I've been using, I use the Midgard Heroes Handbook, Tome of Heroes, the original Book of Lairs, the Tomes of Beasts, Vault of Magic, Demon Cults and Secret Societies. There's another book called 12 Peculiar Towers. This is a book that has these like interesting layers. 12 Peculiar Towers is just a book of kind of like Lairs, right? It's a handful of weird towers. And my thought with this is like, these are great landmarks for their journey. I haven't started using this yet, but as I get into chapter 2 and as I get into the other chapters, I definitely want to dive into this of like weird Lairs and weird towers. And Kobold Press has tons of books of Lairs for all of their monster books. They have these books of Lairs, and I want to go through and use those so that they have locations along the way. This could end up being a pretty lengthy campaign. Like, if I drop in a lot of these little side quests and things like that, I definitely think that this could end up going on quite a ways. But I think that this is kind of a fun way to handle travel, that having like big landmarks, maybe even running a point crawl where people can give directions. Oh yeah, you want to go ahead, but go to the Midnight Tower, but I wouldn't go in the tower. It's dangerous out there. It's right on the edge of the Margrave, and we know what that's like. So you can use a lot of this material as secondary quests, side quests, things like that. I think Empire of the Ghouls really works as this good framework for a great big campaign, a great big expansive campaign with lots of stuff. It is like a central tree with a central plot line that's going on, but lots of ways to fork off. And I think I might end up doing that. So this could definitely be a useful resource for this. 12 Peculiar Towers, plus I think all of the other books of Lairs. Kobold Press has prepared a bunch of different mini encounters that you can have along the way. Those are great ways to sort of fill in, I think, a lot of the travel, but I haven't done it yet, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do it. So Kobold Press just put out their Book of Ebb and Tides, which talks all about the Shadow Fae. It's a book that goes in this whole other thing, and it talks about the Shadow Roads and stuff like this. So this is another book that I plan to kind of take and squeeze out of it. In particular, the appendices at the back have different kind of Shadow Realm encounters and other sort of things that I can tie in. So I think that there's a lot of information in here. The idea of bear folk who operate sort of the guides of the Shadow Roads, I think could be really cool. I don't know if I'm going to run any big, deep adventures in this area, but I think it'll be a good source of material for me to kind of squeeze out some inspiration for their traveling, for their travels across the journey. I love that cover. God, the art in this book is absolutely amazing. So this is definitely my opportunity to use as much of this material as I want. So that really talks about how I'm going to be using Empire of the Ghouls overall, but I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about Chapter 1 and what it's been like to run Chapter 1. So Empire of the Ghouls is a great big book. In the show notes, you can find where I did a whole spotlight on the book where I talk about the whole thing, because I'm going to skip further ahead. So there's a whole thing about the underworld as a place and how that operates, but I'm really going to be talking about the first chapter, which is Dread Chambers of the Undercity. Dread Chambers of the Undercity all takes place in the city of Zobek, and the general idea is that kobolds are being framed for disappearances of people. The disappearances have actually been done by a priestess of Marina and her alliance with a ghoul that's one of the members of the Ghoul Imperium that have come to Zobek to destabilize it. So there's a fair bit of stuff. It's a fun adventure, but there's a fair bit of stuff that I ended up changing in this. And I have no qualm or problem deciding to change some of the stuff that's in this chapter because I enjoyed it. So the first things that I changed is that the first part of the adventure is what I've referred to as Brick's in trouble. There is a nephew of an NPC, Skirtal, who is the owner of this inn in my game. The inn is actually owned by one of the characters, and he works for the inn. And he has a nephew, and the nephew is being accused of kidnapping and murder. They don't actually have a body, so they don't know if she's dead or not, but they are assuming that she's dead. So Brick was accused of this crime, and the characters are conscripted to help prove that Brick didn't do it. One of the things that I changed is the first part of the adventure involves Brick's tasks. And it was like, hey, Brick has a bunch of errands. Why don't you go on errands with Brick? I didn't really dig that idea that like, here's this one kobold who has to bring like rats to different parts, and he needs 6 people to go walk with him to do it. There was something about like, even at level 1, I felt like that was below what adventurers would do. So instead, and as another angle that I wanted to put in here is the idea that the priestess of the Red Queen, the Red Goddess, and the ghoul that she's working with are actually developing a weird drug out of a mushroom extract. And this drug fills those who ingest it with both bloodlust and susceptibility. They become kind of eager for bloodlust and at the same time can be manipulated. And that's so that the priestess and the ghoul can kind of take city politicians and give them this stuff, have them commit these terrible sacrifices and things like that, and then send them back and say like, you've now done this terrible thing, but you now you now work for us. And through this corruption, their plan is to destabilize the government of Zobek so that when the ghouls are going to rise up, there's no defense for it. They sort of want to cause riots in the street. They sort of want to destabilize the sanctity of the city. And they can do so by corrupting nobility over here and accusing kobolds of terrible crimes over here and causing riots to take place. So I wanted to focus more on that than I think the adventure focuses on, but I'm using a lot of the places from the adventure. But instead of the characters following Brick around from these different errands, they mainly follow Brick to go to where he was harvesting mushrooms for food. But the mushrooms he harvested, the same mushrooms being harvested by this gang of were-rats known as the Rotten Kings. And the Rotten Kings are taking this mushroom extract and they are selling it to Felicia, to the priestess and her ghoul boyfriend. And they're using it forward. So the characters can kind of follow this path of, we found out the mushrooms, we found out the Rotten Kings are taking the mushrooms, we go to the Den of the Rotten Kings, which is from the Book of Lairs. They find out that they've been delivering extract to this one group and they've been taking money from an aide to a councilwoman. And so they've had these options of following this political path over here or following this path through the Undercity over here. They did a little bit of both, finding out they eavesdropped on the political person. That's how they found out that the Rotten Kings were doing it. One of the things is I kind of moved the keys so that finding out where this place actually takes place, they would have to do both of those tasks before they would find out that, it's down in the catacombs are where the transfer of this extract takes place. And so now the players are going down there. One of the things that I did change, there's a couple things. They have a good section on here about handling the racism that exists inside Zobek. And this is something that I wanted to be very careful with. There's definitely a lot of racism against kobolds in the city of Zobek. So I had to make it very clear to the players, like, the characters do not engage in this. You guys are friends with the kobolds. You know that the kobolds exist. And instead of like really overplaying the racism stuff that every time a kobold walks by, people just yell nasty things at the kobolds, I said like, well, the reason why is they think that the kobolds are kidnapping these people and that it's building up this sort of grilling, but that the kobolds were actually one of the heroic groups who helped free Zobek. So that it's really not played up that way. But it's definitely, I took note of this particular section that says like, here's, you want to worry about, you want to pay particular attention to how you're handling racism in this game, because it's too easy to like make it, just put too much energy behind it, and then it can steer the game in directions that you really don't want it to go. So I was careful about it talking in session 0 and careful about how I've been handling it in the game itself. Another thing where they don't have a real breakout box for it is there's a lot of what I think I referred to earlier as like weird sex stuff. There is this whole sort of, the whole priestess of Marina is kind of into this, weird sacrificial blood stuff on one side and weird BDSM stuff on the other side. And I don't need to have the BDSM in my game. So I'm kind of like eliminating that part of it and instead getting back to good old traditional, you're ingesting weird drugs and committing sacrifices, right? Like that's more straightforward stuff. That's a very common trope. And you'd say like, why are human sacrifices, why is that better than consensual BDSM? And I have no good argument. I have no good argument for that, other than just like it's sort of an odd thing to have in a game. And even my weird sacrifices stuff is all veiled. Like I don't have gory ass sacrifices occurring. So I changed that a bit, just kind of toning down that part. And I don't even know. I haven't even run the scene yet, so I don't know if there will be some areas where they can see like they were engaged in weird things here. But there was just something about that whole side that kind of steered me off. So I said, I'm just going to downplay that part of it. And I'm going to focus on what we consider to be a pretty traditional D&D kind of adventure where you go into a big room. There's a bunch of people in hoods. There's the person on an altar. There's a priestess with a big dagger, and you get to stop the sacrifice from happening. Pretty straightforward stuff. So that's what I'm going with. I definitely like foreshadow. Boris Cruel is the name of the ghoul. I think he's really cool. And Felicia Baal Sereth is the Red Sister, the priestess of the Red Sister, who are conducting these rituals. And I think that they're a fun power couple in this game. And I don't know what's going to happen with them. They'll probably end up both dead. But it could be that maybe one or both of them manage to get away. They are the ones that are showed here, which I think is kind of cool. Also a little bit of creepy sex stuff going on there, but you downplay that. They just like holding hands. It's not necrophilia if you're just holding hands. So those are some of the things that I've changed in this. And I'm sure I'm going to be changing a whole lot because I don't mind changing campaign adventures. As I'm reading through this, certainly the linearity of the campaign is something that I'm paying attention to, but I know that I can drop in all of these other ideas and sources from other books. I plan to make I didn't mention it, but Southlands is another book that I'm going to be using a lot of when they head down to the south. I think there's lots of opportunities for me to drop my own ideas into this story and expand it out. I think my only worry is, does that mean I'm going to end up with a 2-year-long campaign and my players want to move on sooner than that? So that's certainly something that I have to keep in mind. But there might be entire sections of this campaign that I throw out and replace with something else anyway. So that really covers what I have done with Chapter 1 of Empire of the Ghouls, how I've started the campaign, my thoughts about where it's going, my thoughts about incorporating other Kobold Press products. And I'm really excited. My players are having a good time. It's been very interesting to play this sort of different, it's not a different version of D&D exactly, but like a whole different flavor of D&D, where like really the amount of material that we're using from the core book is essentially tiny little slivers of the player's handbook. And then almost everything else is coming from all of these other Kobold Press books. All of these other books of material that I'm bringing in are bringing in lots of neat things. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, you can help me out by subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter, where you can get a weekly D&D article sent right to your inbox, along with a free adventure generator PDF. You can pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish bookstore. You can see the link to that below. I have new physical versions of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, and the Lazy DM's Companion, all available in physical formats, available for sale there. You can support me directly on Patreon. You can get access to a dedicated Discord channel, a bunch of exclusive adventures, a look at the City of Arches campaign sourcebook, a 38-page city sourcebook, all kinds of material that you get for becoming a patron of Sly Flourish. And you can help me out by subscribing to this video, liking this video, commenting the video, sharing it with your friends. Thank you all very much. Have a great day, and get out there and play some D&D.